ado then, if we move on to look at what is Agile or home working. Perfect. So what is Agile or home working? The first thing to note then is that there is a distinction to be made between Agile working and home working. So whilst the two are often used interchangeably, they are two slightly different concepts. So home working, which is what the majority of the country is or certainly has been doing for the last couple of months, generally means working from home either on an occasional, temporary or permanent basis, rather than sitting in the office. The concept of agile working is slightly different and can be described as working arrangements that enable people to work when, how, and where they like. So, for example, employees are not just limited to working from home. Rather, if they want to go and work in the local coffee shop or sit in the park, they can do. So whilst the two are slightly different concepts, for the purposes of the webinar today, the issues that need to be considered are generally the same. But as a starting point, the first thing that as a business you'll need to decide on is, are we going to have a policy of home working, or are we going to have a bit more flexibility and have, a more agile working arrangement? So that's the first thing really as a business, you need to give some thought to.
So what we're going to look at is agile working and home working, pros and cons. As with anything, obviously there is always a downside, but there's also lots of positives to look at. And if you're a geek like me, I love to look at some statistics because they help to put things into perspective. So we're going to look at it from an employer's perspective and the employee's perspective, and then we'll talk a bit about the drawbacks. So from an employer's perspective, as a business, your primary aim is to make money and to do that as much as possible. So sometimes you might look at how you can cut some of your overhead costs, and this is actually a great way of doing that without reducing your headcount. And not a lot of people have kind of looked at it in that way. So we're going to talk about some of those things now. So the first statistic is that employees felt 90% closer to their colleagues when they are agile working. Now that's really strange because you'd think that, as humans, we want physical interaction with people, but actually often what happens is that we spend more of our time with our colleagues than we do with our families and friends, and tensions can rise. And as HR, you'll have all seen, and we certainly see on a daily basis, grievances being raised about supervisors, colleagues, bullying and harassment, all those kinds of things. So that statistic is pretty massive in the fact that it would bring down a lot of those issues, and which brings me on to the 82% that reported a positive relationship with their supervisors. I'm sure you've all seen it before, that a grievance has been raised, and 9 times out of 10 it's against the line manager because they're constantly supervising, telling them what to do, and often that can cause friction in a relationship. Whereas by agile working, there's that little bit of distance, a little bit more understanding and different ways of dealing with things. So that's something to take into consideration. 25% less staff turnover. Now, again, that's brilliant because as a business, you want to attract and retain talent. And in this day and age with millennials, they're not the traditional, they want to come into the office and work 9 to 5. So you would be attracting those kind of talented people coming through. And not just that, but it's sometimes really difficult to replace a fantastic employee, and a lot of cost goes into the recruitment side of things. So to reduce that is, again, reducing some of the overhead costs. This one was a really surprising statistic for me. 36% of people prefer agile working to a pay rise. I don't know about that, but it certainly at this point in time is something to consider, because I imagine that a lot of your businesses, if you do work on performance-based bonuses, or you'd be looking at pay rises at this time of year, when at the end of the financial year, they might be on hold, and that is going to disgruntle employees, regardless of the fact they're understanding of the situation. For a lot of people, they'll have been relying on that. So if you can look at an alternative of introducing and implementing agile working as a way forward for your business, that may be something to actually keep them happy right now. And equally, it saves you money. Again, as a business, a massive consideration to take into account. And again, another big statistic, which is really interesting, is that 63% of managers linked the growth of revenue with agile working. And we'll come on to why that is when we look at this slide, because we're going to go into a bit more detail about these benefits. So the reason that they would see that increase in revenue is the increased productivity. Now, naturally, at this point in time, it's perhaps not as much the case because we've got children not in school and people are having to kind of juggle childcare with working from home. But ordinarily, if that wasn't the case, then you do find that people are a lot more productive. How you can measure that will depend and vary business to business. But for example, as a firm of lawyers, everything we do is time recorded and we work in obviously units. So it's quite easy for us to see how many hours you do in a day in the office and at home. And we have definitely found a massive difference in people working longer hours, which is also a drawback that I'll come on to later, but being more productive and getting a lot of kind of the meaty work done. I certainly know that I choose to work from home when I've got something like a defence to draw up or witness statements, because it is so much easier to concentrate, there's less disruption, etc. So we talked about reducing overheads. Now, a massive consideration to take into account with agile working is that you don't need as much property. You don't need a big office. You can reduce the number of offices, the number of workstations, the number of computers, the number of phones, and all those things in turn reduce the amount that the business is spending for employees to actually do their job. Now, that's not to say you won't have some costs, because you will need to provide them with the equipment to work from home, but it massively reduces some of the costs. Because if you can get out of it, or you've got a lease coming up that's for renewal and you get out of that for one property and you keep one office only where people can have a booking system to come and work from the office one day a week, or, you know, as and when they need to, that is a massive reduction. Another thing that people haven't quite thought about is the corporate social responsibility element. Now, how many people travel to and from work in their cars? Practically everyone. And if you're not in a car, you're on public transport 9 times out of 10. I certainly don't get on my bike and travel to work. I know people might be trying to do that after lockdown, but we'll see how long that lasts. So imagine if you've got a workforce of 300 people who actually, rather than driving to work every single day, are now working from home. We are reducing the number of cars on the road. Not only that, but people are being paperless, paper light, having them working from home. People are less likely to be going to a printer for things they need. They'll kind of adapt to maybe sharing their screens or having more screens, things that suit them. So it's really important to think about that. And another thing is the powering and the energy usage to power these offices and these stations. You're again reducing that because people are using what they would ordinarily use at home anyway. And there isn't actually a legal obligation at the moment to contribute towards things like broadband and electricity and things like that. There is a kind of suggested you could give a certain amount a week, but it's not, it's not a legal requirement. So that's something to take into account. We talked about attracting and retaining talent, but competitive edge, now that works two ways. It not only gives you a competitive edge in attracting and retaining talent, because people are looking for this flexible working. People have been for a while, and it's not quite something that all businesses have offered until it was kind of, you had to. But it also offers a competitive edge to competitors, because if you are able to offer, additional hours and availability, which your competitors may otherwise not be doing, that's something to take into account. A lot of businesses have had the technology and the resources to work from home or agile for a long time, but it's been this mindset that we just can't do it. I mean, for example, I once spoke to a stockbroker and said, why don't you work from home? And the answer I got was, oh no, we have too many screens. I sit in front of 5 screens and a million phones and I'm always shouting down the phone. It just wouldn't work. Well, actually, that stockbroker, who happens to be my brother, is currently in an office at home and has been for months. So it just goes to show that it can be done. It might not be the traditional way of doing things, but it's certainly time to change that now. So let's move on to looking at the benefits for an employee from the individual's perspective. 24% more people are happier working from home since the lockdown began. So before lockdown, 69% of people said they were happy working from home. And if my maths skills serve me correctly, that's 93% of people are saying that they are happier working from home. That is a huge statistic. You know, I don't think we can all say that working from home is something that everyone wants to do permanently, and certainly not when you're forced to do it, because as with anything, when you're forced to do something you don't want to, but it is the way forward, and people will still have that office interaction provided the measures are in place. And in turn, that knocks on to the 86% that feel it reduces stress. Again, as an employment and HR professional, we advise daily on stress-related sickness absences. If agile working can reduce that stress, make your employees happier, you will in turn see a reduction in sickness absences, a reduction in persistent sickness absences and long-term, because often stress is that one that kind of, you know, rolls out into a long-term sickness absence relating to mental health issues. So if we can remove one element of stress, that can knock onto everything else. 77% believe it improves their general health. Why? Well, if you look at the picture to the side, you know, as human beings, we are told that exercise, eating well, resting, meditating, all these things are great for you. How many of you did not have time to do those things before lockdown? I can certainly say that I definitely didn't have time. I ran around like a headless chicken, and I've suddenly had an opportunity to pause and realize that I'm not doing as many things as I should be for myself. And this has been a great time to introduce those things, because I'm not commuting to work every day. And often some people, for people commuting to Manchester and back, they may be spending 3 hours a day in the car or on public transport. To get 3 hours back in your day is massive. Now, obviously, you can't put a cost on time, or you can if you're a lawyer, but you can't generally put a cost on time. But the value of having, you know, that time to spend with your friends, to get to the gym, have a bit more sleep, you know, that is going to knock on to the productivity you see in your employees. So that's something to take into account as well. And as I said, it reduces HR issues again, which we need to consider. There isn't a value to that, but you know, we know when we're advising our clients that it takes so much time and resource to deal with those tricky issues. And again, we touched on 90% closer to colleagues. That is a benefit to employees. You know, you want to feel close to your colleagues. You work with these people every day for, like I say, probably more time than you spend with your friends and family. So relationships at work are really important. So we talked before about how people work longer hours. The benefits of that for an employee is that they have flexibility to work those hours. Now, if you work in Agile, the point is that they can work when and where they want to. Home working, you may still set that they work 9 till 5, because traditionally, you know, they're the times that your customers or your clients know you're available. But it gives you the flexibility to work around your life. And, you know, I think before lockdown and you know, before home working was a thing, everybody's life evolved around work. And by introducing agile working, it's almost like your work evolves around your life now. You've got the flexibility to move the hours you work. As long as you're doing what you need to get done every day, it doesn't matter when you're doing it. Work-life balance, we've talked about that and how that kind of has a knock-on effect to having time to do other things and be around the family more, which can have, you know, an impact on personal relationships, marriages, children, and all those stresses come into the office environment. So, you know, by giving them that option to have work-life balance, it actually does benefit the business. Productivity we've talked about, and the other three there we have as well. So I'm conscious of time, so I won't go into those again. But let's have a look at some of the negatives and the drawbacks. And it's really important that I stress that all of these have got a solution. So by seeing these, don't think, oh, well, we can't do that. That's not just going to work, because there is a solution. You've just got to be a little bit creative, and obviously it takes a little bit adapting. Now, we're lucky in the sense that everyone's just had to adapt. So we know that we can, and this is kind of a great way to smoothly introduce it as a more permanent change. One of the things that is a drawback is loss of control. A lot of managers, you know, enjoy and their skills enable them to oversee people in a physical environment, to keep an eye on them, manage them, make sure that they're doing their job assess their capability and performance, etc. That is a little bit more difficult when people are working from home because you can't see what they're doing. And as the picture suggests, they may well be having a nap behind their computer screen and pretending to do work when they're not. Or they might be playing video games. You just don't know. So that is where the element of trust comes in. And depending on your business, you would have to look at ways in which you could actually, assess what people are doing. If they are sending a lot of emails every day, then you might be able to look at their sent items just to see that they have been working. I'm not saying that that's something that you need to be doing and you shouldn't really be doing, because that's the element of trust. But in some cases, you may well have to in the beginning just to see how it goes. As I said, for us, it's slightly easier because we do have to time record on a daily basis. So it's quite easy to see what someone has been doing. 17% of people reported that they felt there was a loss of communication and collaboration. That, unfortunately, isn't brilliant. But when you look at the statistic in comparison to others that we've looked at, it's pretty low. And there are ways around that. It does impact on team working and collaboration, which is really important in certain projects. I certainly know that employment as a team, we bounce off each other a lot because there are so many ways to deal with one HR issue. And it only sometimes takes having that one conversation to say, hey, have you dealt with this before? To kind of get a difference of opinions and be able to then give our clients more options. And that is key. And you can't really do that when you work remotely. Not, that you can use things like Microsoft Teams. What we've done is adapted that to having a chat function where people can drop in a question and everyone can reply to it. So it is almost the same, but it will never be the same as a physical interaction. Different management style required. Like I said, there's an element of trust. People, these micromanagers that we have in our businesses who really we're trying to deal with because we don't want them micromanaging, but equally that's their way of dealing with it. Those people are going to struggle. So they might require a bit of retraining. We might need to make sure they've got the facilities and make sure that they know how to still supervise and manage, a conversation every day, keeping on top of performance, because that's still one of the issues that HR will face, and we still need to be able to manage that. 22% of people said they can't switch off. Now, the fact that you can't switch off is definitely a negative, but again, in comparison to the stats we've seen, it's fairly low. And this was the drawback I mentioned earlier when I said people work longer hours. I mean, I certainly know that I, on a Sunday, might be lying on the sofa and I'll see my work phone and I'll think, I'll just have a look and see what's come in. Or at 5 o'clock, you get a bunch of emails and you think, rather than wait until the next day, I might as well just get it done because I'm not about to do anything anyway. And that often starts to blur the lines between work and personal life. For some people, that may not be an issue because for them, they feel better, they feel relieved if they're on top of their work. But for others, it may start to become a bit of an addiction and a slippery slope to just working all the time. So that needs to be managed. And then we've got loneliness. This, again, is something that there's no point in having all these positives towards mental health, well-being and happiness. And then you've got people who actually feel lonely because they perhaps don't have anyone they live with or friends or family in the vicinity. So the only thing they have is work and they rely on going into an office. So you do need to make sure for those individuals, there is the option to still have that physical interaction, still go into the office and still have communication every day with people. That might still be by video call, it works for us. And that might be the way forward. Finally, data security breaches. I'm not going to go into detail on that because our expert Beth is going to talk you through that shortly. So I will pass back to Abigail. I'm not sure if we've got Abigail with us.
Do not worry, I am here. I am
fantastic.
I'm back on. I'm hoping for the next 10 minutes I don't get kicked out again. So thank you very much for that, Trishna. So as we've just heard then, there are a number of benefits to having an agile workforce. But working from home does need to be managed effectively, and there are also a number of practical arrangements, that will need to be addressed by a business when introducing home working arrangements. So the first thing to think about really is the employee's contractual provisions and, the fact that some of the provisions may need to be changed or certainly tailored to fit the specific needs of home working. So when you think about the purpose of an employment contract, it essentially governs the relationship between the employer and the employee. And so if you're going to have an employee who, alters the working arrangements, it's important that the contract is also updated to reflect this. So in terms of some of the contractual provisions then that, may need to be amended, we've got firstly, place of work. So an employment contract should set out the employee's place of work. So where you've got a home worker, the contract should specify, whether the employee's principal place of work is their home or is it the company's premises. Now, if it's going to be the home, then you also need to think about, covering off things like requiring the home worker to attend the office from time to time. For example, for client or customer meetings, team meetings, appraisals, and things like that. The second thing to think about is the hours of work, and Tricia has touched upon this. But are an employee's hours of work going to change now that they're not going to have to do a 2-hour commute in the morning or in the evening? So when looking at implementing home working, it's crucial to establish the boundaries of working time, and in particular, when it's expected that the home worker will be available for work. So are you going to allow the employee to have complete flexibility? Will they be expected to observe strict office hours? Or will there be a core time when they must be available? And the other thing here, just another little pointer in terms of working hours, is rest breaks. Since no one will actually oversee whether home workers take their breaks, the contract should make it clear that home workers are responsible for regulating their own working time and taking breaks as appropriate. Something else to think about is expenses. It's important to be clear on the position regarding expenses and what a home worker can claim for. So, for example, can they claim travel expenses to attend the office? What about a contribution towards telephone, broadband, heating and lighting costs, the cost of any increased insurance premiums, which I'll sort of touch on shortly, all these things that the business will cover. Another common provision relates to sickness. So an employee who works at home will have the same entitlement to sick pay as any other employee, but some thought needs to be given, to the reporting requirements for employees who are sick whilst working from home. How are you going to manage this as a business? What are the reporting requirements? And, what are the expectations from home workers in terms of if they fall ill whilst they're working from home? Confidentiality is another big issue, and whilst employees have an implied duty not to disclose confidential information, in practice confidentiality is a lot more difficult to police and monitor when an employee is working from home. So you might therefore want to include an express confidentiality clause in a home worker's contract, clearly defining, what information is confidential, and that the home worker will be required to keep confidential information secure. So in this sense, you might also want to consider precautions for keeping confidential information secure, such as passwords and encryption, particularly if a device is going to be shared with family members at home, as well as the provision of a secure filing cabinet, for example, or for confidential disposal, such as a shredder or a confidential waste bin, as you would have in the office. If, on the other hand, an employee is going to use their own computer, then make sure that you have a right to monitor work communications on those devices. Something else just to think about is the position in terms of discipline and grievance procedures. So the normal procedures will still apply to home workers in the same way that they do to other employees. But you may wish to use these procedures, to prohibit home workers from using work time for domestic family or other commitments, such as, you know, doing the household chores and running another business, childcare, all these things that you need to think about. And finally, you should also consider, you know, reserving a right to enter the employee's home, for example, to install, maintain and service any equipment that might be provided, and also to recover property on termination of employment, as well as carrying out a risk assessment for health and safety purposes, which again I'll touch on shortly. Aside from the contractual provisions, I'd also suggest that it's sensible and, in my opinion, paramount to put in place a specific home working policy to cover off, you know, some of the more practical arrangements and set out the standards of behaviour expected. So as a department, it's certainly something that we've seen lots of clients ask for recently, it is something that, you know, businesses did have in place, or some businesses did not, and, you know, they've got in contact to ask us about, you know, can you assist in drafting a home working policy for us? And that is something that I would stress, you know, make sure you do have in place. From a data protection point of view, I'm only going to briefly touch on this. As Trishna mentioned, we've got Beth on hand who'll be able to go into a lot more detail on this than me. But companies will need to, you know, satisfy themselves that the risk of a data security breach is low, possibly by way of a data privacy impact assessment. Home workers may also need specific training on, you know, their obligations in relation to data protection and confidentiality, and, you know, also the procedures that they must follow, as well as what is and what is not authorised use of data. From a health and safety point of view, again, I'll just touch on this as David will be able to cover this shortly, but businesses will still retain responsibility for the health and safety of workers, regardless of whether they work, you know, on the company's premises or at their home. So as I mentioned, you will need to conduct a suitable risk assessment to identify any hazards and, you know, assess the degree of risk when it comes to working from home. In terms of equipment, you know, employers are going to need to consider what equipment will be required by a home worker and who will provide that equipment and pay for the equipment. And, you know, given that it's going to be in a home environment, who else can have access to that equipment? You'll need to consider the application of any systems that the company already has in place for policing use of computer systems. So, for example, if you've got an IT and communications policy, it will be advisable to look at amending this to make sure that the policy captures issues that typically affect home workers. And again, if you haven't got such a policy, then I'd certainly, you know, have a look at introducing one. So, for example, issues such as the use of email and the internet, and the extent to which, if at all, either may be used on a personal basis, the company's monitoring of the use of electronic communications and what will be considered, you know, inappropriate use. A policy should also include clear information about the types of monitoring that the company may undertake, and, you know, who will have access to such information. And as I've mentioned, you really need to think about, you know, what will be the position in terms of personal and work use and access to the equipment by others in the household. So will you allow personal use of, say, a company laptop or iPad? Will this be extended to family members? How are you going to police and monitor this? Okay, and finally, in terms of practical considerations, something else that you need to consider, which you might not be aware of, is insurance. So firstly, check that your insurance covers employees working from home. But secondly, the other thing to bear in mind is that any equipment provided by the company will need to be covered by the company's insurance policy if that's possible. If it's not possible, then you should ask the employee to take out and maintain satisfactory insurance cover. And if there's going to be an additional cost over and above sort of a standard home insurance policy, then you'll need to consider, you know, whether you'll reimburse the costs involved. So that's just some guidance on the practical considerations to think about. And then I'm going to just really quickly touch upon this. In terms of, what we might foresee going forwards, employees actually requesting to work from home. This might be something that businesses do see going forwards. And just so that you're clear on the legal position, in case you do start receiving requests to work from home once we're, back to some sort of normality, at the moment, employees do not have an automatic right to work from home. But what they do have, subject to qualification, is the statutory right to request flexible working arrangements. And this might include a request to work from home along with, a change in hours. Now, there is a statutory procedure for submitting and dealing with flexible working requests. So you will need to bear that in mind, if you do receive any requests. And generally, just consider any requests carefully.
Right, morning everyone. Thanks for joining us. But I'm just going to dig a little bit more into the health and safety issues which apply for working from home. First of all, can everybody hear me? It's a little bit, you get no feedback. You can? Good, right, okay, that's fine. Good. Okay, well, look, there's a lot of health and safety legislation out there. Not all of it necessarily defines what constitutes work or work premises, but one thing we have to bear in mind is that the legislation was enacted to keep workers safe wherever they are. So rather than trying to work through what applies and what doesn't in the current situation, you need to assume that it basically does. The legislation confers a positive duty on all employers to ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, which is an important point, the health, safety and welfare at work of all his employees. And it does say his employees. This was a bleak time for equal rights when this legislation was drawn up, I'm afraid. But the requirements also are to provide information, instruction, training and supervision, such as is necessary to ensure the health and safety at work of employees, and to maintain any place of work or work environment, and that's a crucial point, the work environment, in a safe condition without risk to health. So this is going to encompass working from home or agile working as well. What people sometimes also forget is that employers have to try and ensure the safety of anybody who may be affected by their undertaking or their employees' work. So working from home in front of a laptop doesn't often have many risks like that, but some people will have employees who are still conducting home visits or consultations or attending meetings and having other types of human contact, and the legislation applies to that just as much as it does to them. So that means protecting employees from the risk of contracting COVID-19 and for transferring that on. There's also an obligation not just to risk assess, but to review existing risk assessments when they're no longer valid or when there's been a significant change in matters to which they relate. And that's what we've got in the current climate. But there's also a corresponding duty on employees to take reasonable care for their own safety and to cooperate with their employers. So it's not just a one-way street. So what does all that mean? Well, the legislation requires you to risk assess the new work environment and to attempt to remove any risk if you can, or to reduce it as far as it's possible to do so. At work premises, the environment can be easily controlled. You have a kind of equilibrium that gets established where things start to work seamlessly because of systems have been in place for a long time. But during these kind of times of disruption, when people are suddenly forced into a new environment, there's new risks and new challenges which emerge. So you need to revisit those. So how do you comply with that legislation? Well, first of all, review all your existing risk assessments to see whether they still apply. You need to consider whether any addenda are necessary. That might be a single temporary risk assessment dealing with working from home. It may be, just stay on the current slide, Trish. It may be making an addenda to existing ones that you already have, maybe making completely new risk assessments dealing with hygiene and work at home and display screen equipment, that kind of thing. But you also need to consider whether your work systems and processes need adapting. people get used to working in a certain way, especially when working in work premises, and it may be doing the same job, but maybe doing it at home in a slightly different way, which may mean that you need to revisit how your employees are actually doing the work that they're meant to be doing. And you also need to consider whether there are certain categories of people who are disproportionately affected. So do you have wheelchair users or partially sighted people, or whoever else it may be, that may be disproportionately affected by working from home? So there are certain risks to staff of working from home. Repetitive strain injuries are pretty obvious, things like carpal tunnel, musculoskeletal injuries like tendonitis, sore backs and shoulders, that kind of thing. Injuries, tripping over trailing laptop leads, things that are quite easily dealt with in a work environment, but not necessarily at home. As I've mentioned, some of your staff may still need to travel elsewhere, conduct work visits, and that exposes them to a risk of transmitting or contracting COVID. And some workers are still using equipment at home. So, it's not all sitting in front of a laptop and typing away. Some people are actually using work equipment at home as best as they can, and taking those things outside of the work environment or the work premises creates extra risks. There's also the mental health effects caused by balancing work, homeschooling, isolation, working those odd hours, the things that our employment team have already touched upon. You would probably already have a system of pat testing, which you use at work, which works pretty regularly, but employees are now using electrical equipment at home. Has it been supplied by you? Is it their own equipment? Has it been pat tested? Are they using extra additional things that they're plugging into their laptops which haven't been pat tested? This point about insurance, which Abby has touched upon, is very important. Insurers require you to notify them of any material change in circumstances which may affect the policy, either for better or for worse. And working from home and being at home permanently may actually be better for an insurer, or it may be worse, but you need to notify your insurer that that's what's happened, and you should encourage your staff to do that. So what are the risks to the business? Well, most people, me included, are suffering from what most people call lockdown brain. There's a lack of human contact, no change of environment, lack of stimulation. Some people have reduced workloads, and all of that can lead to inattention to detail, forgetfulness, and general kind of work problems. Some people have what they loosely call offices in sheds, garages, mobile homes on the driveway, all sorts of things, and they may be more vulnerable to security breaches. They may be less vigilant in closing down laptops when walking away from them, leaving pen drives around, that kind of thing, which can lead to data breaches. I've mentioned about the risks of RSI and injury claims from tripping over at work, and that's something you can't easily deal with when you don't know what their work environment's like. And again, there's the risk of insurance invalidation. If you don't notify your EL and PL and various other insurers about how many of your staff members are working from home and what risks you've assessed to keep them as safe as possible. And there's a risk as well of knowledge gaps. If you leave people out of the loop, information may be lost, so the processes are missed, and that can create its own risk as well. So how do you manage those physical risks? Well, first of all, you've got to instruct your staff how to work safely. There's a positive obligation to do that. You'd be surprised how many employees will just leave wires trailing, sit on the bed all hunched over the laptop, work where it's dark or there's glare on the screen. Traditionally, people say you have to assume that your employees are stupid and take action accordingly, and that sometimes is right and sometimes is wrong, but you should certainly proactively assess their work environment. But the best way to do that really is to engage directly with them. Could you give them a pro forma risk assessment for them to complete themselves? If they're having issues or questions, they could email HR for advice. They could send in photographs about their workstation to show what environment they're working in. But getting them involved in it makes them feel more comfortable and also protects you as a business. Equipment that's readily available in the workplace often isn't at home. Have you considered issuing headphones to people who are on the telephone a lot? Do you insist that your employees with laptops use mice and keyboards instead of using the trackpad and other things that can cause RSI? Have they taken their office chair home? Do they have back supports, wrist supports? Again, communication's key in all of this. Nothing protects you as a business better than getting staff involved in your own welfare issues. It's worth considering getting staff to complete a weekly, 2-weekly, monthly, whatever is appropriate for your business, questionnaire asking them how they're getting on. Are they having any issues? Whether anything could be done better? Actively consulting with them in their concerns will protect you in terms of if there were any allegations at a later date. Then you can show that you have actually engaged with your staff about these different issues, and of course try to keep them as safe as they can, which is the primary motivator behind all this. The mental health side of things we've already touched upon. You need to actively, proactively deal with that as well, and instruct your staff how to manage stress and mental health issues. Wherever you can, you should check in with them regularly, create team building exercises, communicate between teams regularly as best as you can. Have a system for reporting. Can employees get in touch with somebody? Is there like a buddy that is nominated to them, or a key contact, so they know there's a particular line that they can go down where they know they won't be judged if they are having any difficulty? And again, your weekly questionnaire would help with that if you did choose to go down that option. The last thing I want to talk about before I pass on to Beth is what I call corona blindness, which is basically taking your eye off the game whilst all those more immediate matters are distracting you. For some businesses, working from home is a very temporary measure, and staff will be going back to premises as soon as they can. But for others, there will be consideration given to long time either work from home or agile working. And depending on which option you choose, you need to consider the longer term consequences. If your staff are going to be working from home on a more medium to long term basis, then those risk assessments will change slightly. Your display screen equipment will become more important over a period of time. The reduced social interaction and mental health problems will become more pronounced over time. It may not even come about at all for the first 12 months. So those risk assessments are going to be, particularly vulnerable people, are going to become extremely important. But for those businesses who are intending to go back to work, to bring people back to premises, you need to make sure your premises are ready for them. How are your welfare facilities? A lot of offices have been closed. Have they developed damp or fungal problems in the meantime? Have the offices been cleaned as often? Probably not, because nobody's been in them, potentially. And then there's some slightly kind of more unusual ones. The HSE recently released advice about Legionnaire's disease. Every employer has a duty to prevent the spread of Legionnaire's. But if your water system's not being used and it's just remained kind of stagnant for several weeks, especially during this hot weather, then the risk of Legionnaire's is hugely increased. You need to consider what will happen, not be caught out by the announcement that we can now go back to work. You need to think about it now and consider whether you should be deep cleaning, assess how you can keep staff socially distant in offices, kitchens, bathrooms, shop floors, that kind of thing. And you need to consider closure of any areas where people may be allowed to congregate and spread the risk. So that's everything from me. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of health and safety. If you need any more information on that, then you can ask questions at the end or get in touch with me direct. But I'll now pass to Beth, who will deal with data protection.
Thank you, David. So I'm Bethany. I'm just going to touch upon some of the data protection issues that arise while we're working from home. I'm aware we're running out of time, so just bear with me as I do a bit of a whistle-stop tour just for some of the key data protection points that we should be considering. So the starting point is the law in the UK for data protection is set out in the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, and is supplemented by the Data Protection Act 2018. All this regulation is overseen by the Information Commissioner's Officer, who enforces these regulations and takes investigatory action, fines, audits, and investigations against companies and organisations that breach these pieces of legislation. If you've had any dealings before with the GDPR or the Data Protection Act, you'll know how broad it is. So unfortunately, there isn't a specific section in there that says how we should conduct remote working. But what it does do is set out some broad principles for data protection that we must apply to the home working principles. So we could just move on to the next slide, please. Thank you, Trish. One of the principles in the GDPR is that we should keep personal information safe and secure. It's called the Integrity and Confidentiality Principle, and it just means that we should prevent information from being lost, stolen, or even accessed by unauthorised people who aren't entitled to see that information. So this poses some particular challenges whilst we're working from home and the employer doesn't have control of what exactly is being done with that information at all times. The key point, as Abigail has touched on earlier, is your policies and procedures. Your staff need to be aware that data protection policies and procedures apply just as much to those staff that are working at home as they do when the staff are in the office. You need to set out in your data protection policy procedures for handling, accessing and disposing of confidential information, personal information. Really, you need to have a look at what happens in the event, unfortunately, something goes wrong. Would you be able to look back at your policies and procedures and said, yes, the employee was instructed on how to use personal information safely, and in fact, they're the ones that are in breach of our own policy and procedure. One of the key areas that we're seeing to consider whilst people are working at home is confidential waste. If they are having access to printing, if people do have files, paperwork at home, they really need to be aware that they can't just be placing that in the ordinary waste bin, recycle bin, just like they wouldn't do that in the office, they shouldn't be doing it at home. So having to think about what procedures you've got in place to ensuring that confidential waste is dealt with appropriately whilst people can't access the office. The other issue that we've seen a huge rise of recently is from the use of passwords. So obviously from a security perspective, those passwords should be complex and they shouldn't be disclosed to anybody else. What we've seen, particularly during lockdown, is a huge rise in malicious phishing attempts. So that is where a malicious user will hack into your system by sending emails to your staff and requesting them to click through links and enter their username and password. Whilst you're in the office, you might be able to, say to your colleague, "Oh, do you think this is suspicious?" But while we're at home, our guards are down, and you need to be reminding staff of not to click on unauthorised emails, even emails that look legitimate. If there's something suspicious, they should not be entering their username and password. So making sure that regular communications are sent in that regard. That brings us on to the use of remote access. So this is the way in which your staff can access your systems remotely, so while they're working at home. So the Information Commissioner's Office, they recommend that you use a two-stage approach. So it's called a multi-factor authentication. But in simple speak, it just means that there's two levels of security to go through before you can access your own system. So typically you'd enter your username and password, and then another message would be sent normally to your mobile phone with a code that you enter to get in. That way, if your password is ever compromised, and as we've seen, it has happened recently, people are able to get into your system by the password, then they would be stopped because they wouldn't then receive that code again. So it just gives you an extra level of protection to think about when you're looking at how employees access your systems remotely. We've seen it again, bring your own device, which is employees using their own devices, which Abigail's also touched on earlier. Whilst this has huge cost savings for the business and there's lots of benefits, users are much more familiar with their own devices, there's a risk from a data protection point of view of a loss of control of that information that's being used on that device. So there are technical solutions that you can put in place which segregate work content from the device that's being used for personal use, but really having to think about how your bring your own device policy is set out. Are employees allowed to store information on that device, or does it have to be stored within your network? From data protection point of view, we wouldn't recommend that you let your employees store or save items on their own device, because if you ever needed to have access to that information, you're going to struggle to to get it if it's not stored within your own system. And you've not got the same control over it if it's sitting on your own system or within your own private cloud account. So just some points to think about when you're looking at your bring your own device policy. In terms of use of apps, we've all really got used to using new technologies, so video conferencing apps, which I'll touch upon in a minute, or WhatsApp, whichever means you're using to keep in contact with your team. These measures are probably being pushed through the business at a much faster rate than what you would usually do. So it's having to think about what apps you're permitting your staff to use for work purposes, or if there's any in particular that you do not want them to use because you don't consider that they're secure. That should be made clear. And just having to think at the end, once the dust is settled, once we're back to a more usual way of working, is the apps that you're using to keep in touch with people, are they the most appropriate ones for your business to be using, or is there something that you think is better or more secure, which if you'd had the time at the beginning of lockdown to consider, maybe perhaps you wouldn't have used. Just have a look, keep it under regular review to make sure you're using the most secure system. Confidentiality we've already touched on, but it's really easy when employees are working from home for other members of the family to pick up devices, to access emails, to see what people are talking about on the phone. Again, if we can segregate work content from personal devices, then it would stop any unauthorised people being able to access this information. I know it's quite common if all your devices are linked, members of your family could end up seeing emails that you're receiving for work. So just having to think about measures that you can put in place to make sure that that doesn't happen. And then finally, you should have the breach reporting. That should apply whether or not you're in the office or not, should apply just the same. Employees should be coming to you for those breach reports. We'll just quickly move on to the next one, Trish, please. Just a quick touch on video conferencing. Again, whichever method you're using, just be aware of the privacy settings that we all entered passwords to get in here today. And again, just be aware of the phishing risk. People are really on the rise for phishing at the moment. They can hack into the chat and ask you to enter details in there. So make sure your rooms are locked and make sure you've got a password on there. And just again, at the end of this whole period, keep that under review, having a look at if that tool is the best one for your business. Can we just move on again, please? Yeah, so in relation to subject access requests, and it does tie into the use of video conferencing and bring your own device, is that over this period we've seen subject access requests coming in from employees who know that meetings have been recorded where they've been discussed and wanted access to that information. Now, I'd say if you are recording meetings, you should have a good reason to. So if you wouldn't usually record that meeting while you're in the office, having a careful think about why you're now deciding to record it. Simply because the function's there doesn't justify the use of recording, and it can pose you some problems in terms of it can be quite costly to redact that meeting footage when it's requested. So it's just having to think about when your employees know when to record and when they shouldn't be, because they should certainly be making people aware that they're recording and giving them the opportunity to turn their mic and their camera off. Also, in terms of where information is saved, if subject access requests come in for information that's been created while employees are working at home, you need to have it able to be searched. And if that's on your employee's own device and not within your own system, it makes it much more difficult for you to do, and you need to make sure that that's covered in your policy and procedure, what would happen in that event. In terms of looking at the risks for everyone, for individuals to data protection, if you were thinking of implementing Agile or home working as a long-term solution, you'd want to be completing what's known as a data protection impact assessment. So this is essentially a risk assessment for data protection, just to show that you've considered all the data protection risks and what you've got in place to mitigate those risks. So this will typically deal with setting out how you will comply with each of the data protection principles, how you can ensure that you'll comply with subject access requests or any other rights that are made from individuals. What updates do you need to make to your existing policies and procedures? I assume most people's policies and procedures were drafted around 2 years ago when the GDPR came into force. They probably don't cover video conferencing or video calls because it wasn't envisaged. It's probably going to need to be in a section in there that covers how that information is handled. And again, finally, we recommend this is kept under regular review at the moment. Like I said, this has all been done really quickly. Things have got pushed through very quickly. So we need just to take a step back and when the dust settles, have a look at these, the best, most secure methods that we're using to keep in touch with our colleagues and clients as we go forward. So that I appreciate, I know we've completely run out of time. So if anyone's got any questions, please just get in touch with me directly. Our details will be going out at the end.
Thank you, Beth. Apologies, everyone, that we have run out of time. We obviously have a lot to share with you, and we are looking at kind of the impact that COVID has had in bringing this in, but also the longer term considerations, because we want to make sure that you're equipped and you've got the things to be thinking about in terms of practical considerations. Just a couple of HR things to touch on from what David and Beth were talking about. So bring your own device policies. Again, this is not something that's standard in handbooks, because again, it wasn't something envisaged or something that was common. So it's certainly something people need to be looking at putting into place. And recording meetings, again, we would always say that that needs to be something covered off in your handbooks, because it works both ways. It might be that employees are recording video conferencing meetings. You can see, well, I can see, I'm not sure about you guys, but a little red dot that's flashing at me on my screen. But I might not have otherwise noticed that, and I wouldn't know I'm being recorded. So we've got to be careful about those covert recordings and how we manage them. But equally, as Beth said as well, there's pros and cons to recording your internal meetings. And from a HR perspective, looking at how that might pan out in tribunals, absolute disaster waiting to happen. You know, we need to be careful, because if you're having private discussions about employees, whilst that is all disclosable, you obviously want to be being careful what is discussed, how it's being discussed, and making sure that data protection elements are being considered. We would still be advising people to minute things as you normally would, having a note taker if you're having meetings with the employee directly or internally, etc. Also, David touched on some of the considerations about adaptations for people perhaps with disabilities. Again, from a HR perspective, we've not had time today to go into that depth, but you do need to be thinking about reasonable adjustments and ways to ensure that there is no discrimination, which is something, a whole topic for another day. So we don't have time, unfortunately, to go through Q&As. I'll just talk you through the Agile Working Toolkit that we've pulled together as part of this webinar. So it is free for those of you who are our existing HR Complete and in-house HR clients, and otherwise we've set it at a fixed fee of $350 plus VAT. What that's going to include is some of the contractual clauses that Abigail went through in her section, and she talked about, you know, the changes to the place of work, hours of work, etc. So we will provide you with some template clauses. If they need to be made more bespoke, then there may be some additional costs. A homeworking policy. This is going to be, again, a template, but if you need it to be more bespoke, to bring in some of the agile working kind of elements, working from elsewhere, not just home, then we can certainly assist with doing that. And a data protection impact assessment will be included. Obviously, there are other things that you will need to think about, such as your data protection policies being updated, you bring your own device policies, and all of those things we can assist with. And as you can see, even though we're all from different teams within Forbes, this does cross over many elements of our expertise, and we can cover all of those bases for you. So what we'll do, because we have run out of time for the Q&As, we will be following up with you all just to get some feedback. And at that point, you'll have an opportunity to raise any specific questions that you have. If there is any questions in the chat box and we're able to access them, I'm not exactly sure how that works. But if there is, then we will answer those questions when we follow up with you as well, so that you'll have that. All of our details are there on the screen, and obviously this has been recorded and will be shared and sent out, so you will have access to it. So if any of your colleagues were booked on and couldn't attend, please do share it with them and let them know that they can check in. And Other than that, have a fantastic day. Enjoy the sunshine wherever you are. And thank you for joining us.